Hi, my name is William Dean. I'm going to be talking about the Tina Brandon story. Now, when I talk about my story, I'm going to try to keep the pronouns as correct as possible. Tina Brandon or Brandon Tina went by he or she throughout her life, um, multiple different times, and I'm going to try and keep it as correct as possible and try and do this in one take to not have to make cuts. And I wrote a script, but we'll see how it goes. But just so you know, I may mess up the pronouns at one point, and I will try to keep them as correct as possible. So to start off, Tina Brandon and two others were attacked and murdered. Tina was a girl who identified as a man, but went by Brandon Tina. He had many girlfriends, and all of them talk about how incredible of a guy he was. They all spoke about how he knew what a woman wanted while having the perspective and presence of a male. Many of his girlfriends were unaware of the situation that they were in, dating a female, being a female. But none of them seemed too upset about it. They were all upset at first because they were deceived and lied to, but they said that in the end it didn't really matter. It would have just been better if they knew. Um, he himself was struggling, which is also why they understood that it wasn't as big of a deal as they could have made it. So it was very nice that those people were understanding. Um, and when Tina was very young, her family was very concerned about her well-being because she spoke about suicide and having a lot of problems and not fitting in. And she actually went to a crisis hospital, which is where she really learned about sex change. And she came out of the crisis hospital wanting sex change. Um, and of course, that was difficult for him, especially at an early age, with the stigma of transsexuals and people with that are transgender. Especially over 20 years ago, the stigma about it was a lot different than it is today. He constantly got in trouble for stealing and forging checks. He wanted to spend money on people that he really liked to make them happy. He seemed to be always seeking approval, which makes sense for someone that doesn't feel like they fit in. He's constantly looking for people to approve of what he does. So he's always constantly buying gifts for people after using the money that he stole. Now, after all that happened, he moved away because a lot of people knew about his situation. He wasn't comfortable that everyone knew his situation, and he felt like he should go to a new place to experience new people. He ended up moving to Falls City, which was a very bad place at the time. It was known for having a lot of domestic violence and a lot of other um, random crimes happening around town. There were not many gay people, and no one's ever met someone that had a switched gender in that town, so it was very difficult for them to understand that perspective and understand the idea of that. Um, every person that was interviewed, once again, talked about how nice of a person he was and how sweet he was to everyone. But that seemed to change once everyone found out that he was a woman, especially in the second town. Everyone interviewed in the second town seemed to have much more of a dislike for Brandon than his original town. And once again, he was arrested for forging checks, and that's how this really got out. When he was arrested, the sheriff announced that he was female, and a lot of people, no one actually knew at this time that he was female in his new town. And that's kind of what started the whole escalation of the situation. One of his exes, Lana, was the person who bailed him out of jail, and a lot of people felt like he should leave town. And he no longer felt comfortable or happy once everyone was aware of the situation, but it unfortunately escalated much too quickly. And once again, like I said before, once people found out, especially the interviews from Second Town, a lot of people seemed really angry at him, including those that didn't commit crimes against him, but just that were around them. Like his ex-girlfriend's mother was very mean to him, especially in the interview. She talked about how she very much disliked Brandon. And this is what brings me to this point, is one of the most horrifying occurrences that happened in this story is when Lana's mother forced Brandon to prove that he was male or female. She forced him into a back bedroom and forced him to pull down his pants. And he wouldn't. And that's when everything really started to escalate. Um, Tom Nielsen and John Lauder were both friends of Lana, and they came in and they took Brandon by the arms and they forced his pants down, and they forced Lana to look. And of course, this is wrong. Um, no one deserves to be sexually harassed or harassed in any type of way, just because people feel like they should know something. It's not other people's rights to know about these things, and if Brandon didn't want them to know, then they shouldn't have. Now, this is where everything really started to escalate as they forced Lana to look at Brandon and prove that he was a man or not. And then after she looked, they forced her to leave, and it was Brandon was alone with these two guys, Tom and John. He said he felt safe, and that's why Lana left. But this is where the situation really takes a turn. Um, Brandon was taken and beaten by them, and they took him into the woods, and then they raped him. Um, and then after they beat him some more, and they put him back in the car and brought him back to Tom's house. And after Tom raped him, he asked if they were still friends, and as Brandon was confused, beat up, and uncomfortable and happy, he just said yeah and just went with it. Um, Tom also had trouble performing. He said he couldn't have sex with a girl that looked like a guy, but he forced himself to have sex with her anyway. Um, Brandon's mother said that his biggest fear was always to be raped by a male. He never wanted to be touched by a male, and it happened. Both of the rapists, Tom and John, were both former criminals, and neither one of them wanted to go back to prison. And many of the people were giving them grief for having sex with a woman that looked like a man. A lot of people were calling them gay and fags, and that really also made the escalation of the situation a lot worse because they felt like they needed to handle the situation to make themselves look better. The sheriff was also incredibly unhelpful. He was berating and harassing Brandon while he was trying to report the assault and the rape. He was asking questions that did not need to be asked, and more for his interest or making Brandon feel bad about the situation, which is wrong. And that's one of the biggest problems with law enforcement in these type of situations are people's personal biases of getting in the way of justice. And I think that's a huge problem. When people have power, they think they can do whatever they want with it, and they will do what they please with it, not exactly what is right. Not everyone, but a lot of people, once they get into a position of power, will abuse their power. Now, Brandon Teena went to stay with her friend Lisa Lambert in Humboldt, Nebraska, and very soon after, Brandon Teena, Lisa Lambert, and Philip Devine were all found murdered in Humboldt. Um, John Lauder and Tom Nilsson were all charged with murdering Teena Brandon and her two friends, and they just did this to clean up the evidence. They thought if they were able to get rid of the evidence, that everything would be fine. Now, it's really sad to see just how much people's personal biases can force them to do the wrong thing. I myself was a victim of people's personal biases, but that's not what's important right now. But I just have a connection to the story a little bit. It's also awful just to see how bad people's personal biases can be when they attempt to ruin someone else's life. When someone decides that they have to take justice into their own hands to do what they think is right, even though it's not. And Tom had nothing to do with Brandon Teena's identity crisis, and neither John, and they shouldn't have had anything to do with it. They should have never been involved in the first place, and this was like this whole thing was just wrong. Of course, the sheriffs did nothing to help with it because of their own personal biases. They believed that Brandon Teena was in the wrong because he himself stole, and they didn't understand the situation. They didn't understand the perspective, and it's just sad to see how people can decide what is wrong or right just because of something they don't understand. Um, Overall, I found this to be a very informative story. Things have changed a lot since times back then. There's a lot People are a lot more understanding of transgenders and people with different genders and people that are confused about their gender. And there's just a lot. It's a lot better now today. If Brandon Teena was around today, he wouldn't have had to deal with things these bad with this problem being as bad as it possibly was. Um, Overall, it's a very sad story, and I'm very sad for what happened to Brandon Teena. And it's just sad to see how people believe they could be doing the right thing when it's just the wrong thing. Thank you.